Let's talk about film, shall we? So I've already done videos on vampires. I still got another one to do, and I've done one on werewolves. And another of the ancient tropes in horror cinema is the ghost. And like the vampire and the werewolf, the ghosts have gone all the way back into the oral traditions of ancient peoples and stuff like that. And of course, at some point, it had to get translated into cinema, right? Now, the interesting thing about Ghost is that there's a lot of different versions of it, and I'm going to get into that as I do this. This video is going to be kind of long, but I'm going to be talking about how the different concepts of hauntings and possessions and things of that nature kind of tie into a conversation here. So, anyway, so let's begin. Uh, Ghosts have been in cinema for a long time, and it's been in literature for a long time. Now, up until the early 1900s, ghosts were typically portrayed as like, some guy, with chalk white skin with chains on, i.e., uh, Charles Dickens, or like somebody with a white sheet, little holes cut out, like Casper the Friendly Ghost or whatever. And um, it wasn't until Henry James did The Turn of the Screw that ghosts developed a definitive form. And the definitive form is they can look like anybody, right? They can be anybody, right? Which is kind of harkens back to a lot of the traditions of folklore that a ghost can be anybody or anything for really that matter. And they've had ghost stories in hundreds of different scenarios, right? And so I'm going to talk about some movies I think which I think capture the essence of the story, and I think have done some really innovative things, right? So let's talk about um, the earliest origins. Um, there's been hundreds and hundreds of movies, so to me it'd be kind of a waste of time to sit here and talk about even a fraction of them. So I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit up until the 1960s. And there's a movie that Robert Wise made, which is based off a Shirley Jackson novel called, and they're actually doing a kind of a revision of it. It's a series on Netflix right now, and it's called The Haunting of Hill House. Now, The Haunting of Hill House follows the same pattern as Turn of the Screw, whereas the hauntings are very ambiguous. You don't know if they're actually ghosts, if it's a manifestation of that woman's psychosis. You don't know if if it's real. I mean, if if she always has been. I mean, if the central character has always been a ghost, if she's always been in the house. I mean, nobody. I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions, and ghost stories tend to lend themselves to that concept. Now, in you look at something like Stephen King's The Shining. It intentionally has a lot of that ambiguity built into it. That's why I think that movie has been so uh, misunderstood. Is because the way it was set up like a classic traditional gothic ghost story where there's a lot of ambiguity. I mean, you don't know if Jack is crazy, if the house actually is haunted. I mean, the only little tidbit of evidence that suggests that in fact, the house is haunted is the fact that Jack gets out of the cellar, but you don't know if he actually finagled his way out of it, or maybe Wendy did it, or maybe the kid did it. I mean, you don't know because everything's done off camera, which is the way ghost stories are. I mean, it's very, it lends itself to a very ambiguous sort, right? And then the great thing about the ghost character, especially in literature and certainly in cinema, is they're so flexible. You can have characters that are seemingly normal, but can be in fact a ghost or be possessed by a ghost, right? And those kind of tropes have been followed very closely in cinema and in literature. And so it's the easiest, hypothetically, it's the easiest type of film or story to tell, and it also it lends itself to a lot of flexibility. Whereas the werewolf, you kind of have to have a creature in there somewhere, right? Unless you're talking about the unless you're talking about the more of the psychological style. But to me, that's like, well, that's not really a werewolf. That's more of a psycho story. That's more of like, Silence of the Lambs, or Norman Bates or something like that. Whereas in vampire stories, you have to have a vampire. And again, I mean, you could say, well, you could have an Egyptian god that blah blah blah, but it's still a vampire, right? I mean, you still have to have somebody that's physically a. There has to be a set of parameters that have to kind of be followed, depending on how you set up the story, right? Ghosts can be anybody, can be anything, right? As a matter of fact, there was a television show that used to come on a long time ago, which I used to watch in rerun when I was a kid, called Dark Shadows. And one of the little tropes they used to pull is if a character dies, they just bring him back as a ghost, right? And I mean, it was genius because it's so ridiculously simple. And and you see that like in Star Wars, right? Of course, Obi-Wan gets killed, and he comes back as a ghost, right? And at the very end of Return of the Jedi, you got all three of them. You got Anakin Skywalker and Yoda, and then of course you got Obi-Wan, and they're all ghosts, right? And then one of them, you got Liam Neeson's character comes back, Qui-Gon Quinn, or whatever the hell his name is. He comes back as a ghost too, right? So right there, I mean, there's a lot of room to really work. And however, there still is a lot of cliches. And now, Robert Wise's The Haunting really explored the idea of psychological horror. The ghost was never actually seen. It was implied, but never actually seen. You hear like knocks at the door and footsteps and stuff like that, but it's never actually seen, which kind of brings up a heightened terror. Now, I'm of the mind that sometimes it's better not to show things. Sometimes it's better, to let the audience's imagination run wild. Now, another thing that was very effectively used in recently was a movie that was pretty controversial, but I thought it was awesome. Sadly, it's kind of been mired down by sequels and stuff like that, but the original one I thought was great, and that's, of course, Paranormal Activity. And to me, Paranormal Activity, it's a found. I'm not typically a big fan of found footage movies, but it gives a sense of depth in the sense that you're actually looking at what's going on. It's very subtle things. It's not some big special effect. It's not some big, you know, monster comes out of the closet or something like that. It's basically a bunch of subtle little things that kind of builds and builds and builds till you get to the very end. And then, of course, when you get to the very end, then you begin to see things kind of coalesce into this strange, almost terrifying ending, which I thought was pretty good. I mean, I thought it was pretty smartly done, right? And now, sometimes you can do a ghost story where it is in fact a kind of a special effects kind of deal, right? Like The Conjuring. I thought The Conjuring was great. I mean, I remember we're sitting in the theater, and me and everybody around me was jumping all over everywhere because it was so well done, and it had like a lot of the classic ghost tropes, but it also kind of pulled them into a new direction. In Annabelle 2, which I thought was another pretty good one in that series, also had those kind of moments where like you think you're looking at something but you don't know, and it's like, I mean, the characters don't know and the audience doesn't know, and like some people see it, some people don't. It's like the gold dress or whatever. And to me, that's the way a ghost story should be. Now, there's a lot of examples I can start giving off, but like I said, The Haunting is a pretty good place to start. The Haunting. Robert Wise is The Haunting, not the remake in the '90s of Liam Neeson. That's crap. Don't watch it. And also, if you haven't seen it, watch the first Conjuring. It's actually pretty good. It follows a lot of the tropes too. Now, there's a movie that came out in the '80s, very early '80s, that had George C. Scott, called The Changeling. Right, and make sure if you rent it or whatever, make sure it's the one from I believe it's 1980. Don't get the one from the 2000s with Angelina Jolie. That's the Clint Eastwood movie. That's a totally different type of story. But The Changeling is a ghost story, but it's also a mystery, right? And that's another trope that gets explored quite a bit. And you can tell a pretty compelling mystery using a ghost story. As a matter of fact, ironically, there's a movie, and now the movie was okay, but the novel was really good. But there's a movie called Ghost Story, and it's about a mystery. It's about something happens to this woman, and she comes back and starts terrorizing these old men. Right, and this is like in the early '80s, late '70s, early '80s. And of course, these guys are played like Fred Astaire and all these like old Hollywood guys. And it also kind of follows the concept of a ghost can be anybody. It could be anything, It can come in any guise, right? A spirit of vengeance, if you will. And now, some of the more common versions would be like The Others with Nicole Kidman. That is a more of kind of the Turn of the Screw style, where it's actually people, people, portraying the ghost, and they're not necessarily aware of it, right? And then, like I said, Ghost Story is another one where you don't really know who the antagonist is, or what you just know that the antagonist exists, right? And you don't quite know what she's up to, right? And then of course you get into something like The Changeling, where the ghost is basically telling a mystery. It's basically kind of cluing the audience and cluing the characters in that there's something happened, and it's kind of up to the characters to kind of figure it out. Now, there's another type of ghost story which is pretty rare, but does happen on occasion, and it's the story of reincarnation. And there's a movie that came out back in the '70s called Audrey Rose, which had Anthony Hopkins, and it's kind of one of those kinds of stories where you don't know who the character is, or what she is. You just know that she's um, different. She's not right, you know. And sometimes you get what they call the bad seed, and that's where, like, somebody, like a kid's born evil, right? And again, you don't know if the kid is possessed by a ghost or if the kid's just born evil, right? But there tends to be little hints here and there, right? And the last type is just the old-fashioned haunted house story, right? And that's the one like Poltergeist. The Conjuring kind of fits in that. The Conjuring 2 certainly does. And that's more of like, there's a ghost there, and they're haunting, but they don't know. You don't know what the hell they're trying to, what the hell's going on. You don't know what's trying to be conveyed. And again, those kinds of stories are very hard to do right, but when they're done right, they're great. And so yeah, I mean, and there's another one which you see fairly frequently, is the one where one of the characters actually is a ghost, but the audience is unaware of it, right? And there was a movie that came out back in the early '70s, written by a guy by the name of Thomas Pynchon, right? He's a good writer. Or I'm sorry, Thomas Tyrone. I'm sorry, Thomas Tyrone, and he wrote a book called The Other, which is about that, where you got these two kids, and kind of gave it away. I mean, one of the kids is not really there, and there's a J horror movie that got remade into a fairly decent one. For the life of me, I can't remember what the hell it's called, but it was about two sisters, and it's kind of a similar situation where one of them actually died in a fire, and of course you don't know that. You're watching the movie, and you're like, well, wait a minute, what the. And there's a movie that was made in Paraguay that was remade in America a couple years ago called Silent House. So that also has that concept, where a bunch of this weird shit's going on, and then you come to realize that the ghosts are not really ghosts. They're almost like harbingers of prophecy or whatever. So anyway, but yeah, there's a lot of different films to really get into. Now, some of the tropes would be like it's a mystery, and strange things start happening. And when that starts, as an audience member, it's best to start kind of paying really close attention to what's going on, to kind of see where the story's going. Because sometimes the ghost can be like an omen. Other times it can be the central focus of the story. And now like I said, there's a ton of stories I can name drop in the last several years or whatever. But I would start with like The Haunting. I think that's still one of the better ones that was made, the Robert Wise one. And then Poltergeist, which is a lot of fun, but it's a ghost story. The Others is another really good one. There's a movie called The Haunting, which came out, not The Haunting, The Haunted, which has Aidan Quinn, which came out in the late '90s or mid '90s, and it's a really good one. It's based off James Herbert, but based off a James Herbert novel. He's a horror writer from Britain. Paranormal Activity is really good. The Conjuring 1, Conjuring 2, I think are pretty good, solid ghost stories. And and then of course Audrey Rose, which is a Frank Del Feta novel. That's a pretty good one with Anthony Hopkins. That came out in the late '70s. And The Other by Thomas Tyrone. That's pretty good. And I think if you're really into that kind of stuff, I mean, you're really into movies that really kind of have a mystery to them. Well, definitely watch those. Like I said, there's been a whole bunch of them. Some are pretty good, some of them are not so good. But definitely the ones I just named off. Those are really good. Those got like an interesting twist to it. And so anyway, I was hoping this little video will shed a little light on the subgenre of horror movies, and I shall talk to you guys later.